All right, howdy, folks. This is the fourth PowerPoint for the first unit. This PowerPoint is going to be covering it's going to piggyback off of the Unit 1 Ed Puzzle 1, which I need to assign. 1 second, please. Hold on. Okay, I'm back. Figured it all out. I'm very scatterbrained, so I apologize for that. Anyways, all right, creating the Constitution. So this, like I said, this will piggyback right off of the first Ed Puzzle, which was about the Articles of Confederation, our very first governing document. It was very weak. It did not work, and that's why it is no longer our governing document. So we're going to go ahead and jump right on into creating the Constitution, and I'll tell you why the Articles were tossed in favor of this Constitution. All right. So first of all, ratifying conventions. Once the Constitution was decided upon, I'm kind of jumping ahead here. In hindsight, I probably should put this at the very end of the PowerPoint, but whatever. Once the Constitution was decided upon, it had to go to the states to be ratified. If you don't know what ratified means, it basically means like to approve of. And 9 of the 13 original states had to approve of the Constitution before it could go into effect. So it went to the states, and then the states would decide whether or not they wanted to ratify the Constitution. So why ratifying conventions? Because supporters of the Constitution believed that it was the only way that the Constitution had a chance. People who were at the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia, which we're going to talk about in just a second, they thought that this was going to be an exciting new governing document. So if they could take this back to their home states and get people to buy into it, then people would support the Constitution. Boom, there it is. On your own, real quick, there's this quick video about Federalists versus Anti-Federalists. These were the two factions at the Constitutional Convention. So watch this video real quickly, and then you'll move on to the next slide, which I'm just going to go ahead and do. So the Federalists, these were people who supported the new Constitution. These were people who saw that the Articles of Confederation were too weak and that we needed a stronger central government. So these are people in favor of the Constitution. All right. Most of these people were large landowners, judges, lawyers, and merchants. Merchants being business people, all right, people who engaged in trade, all right. So if you can look at North Carolina, you can see here, according to the color-coded map, Federalists were green, Anti-Federalists were yellow. So if you look at North Carolina here, the bits of green that you see, right, along the coast here, and then a little bit right here, a little bit right here. The reason why those parts of North Carolina were more Federalist is because those are where a lot of large landowners lived. All right, especially along the coast, that's going to be where a decent amount of plantations are going to be. So people who own a lot of land and people who work on those plantations, slaves. All right. Now that does not mean that the slaves were supporting this new Constitution, but the people who own the slaves, those large landowners, those plantation owners, because they wanted the federal government to protect the institution of slavery because it helped them financially. All right. But you can tell here that for the most part, the judges and lawyers and merchants, more northeastern folks, that's the reason why much of the Northeast was in support of the new Constitution, because this new Constitution was going to help them in terms of their businesses. All right. The Anti-Federalists were those who were against the Constitution. These included folks like Patrick Henry, the guy who gave the very famous "Give me liberty or give me death" speech during the Revolution. They're mostly going to be rural agrarian types, so people who are apprehensive and afraid of what a big federal government could do. So if we go back here real quickly, you'll see that this is mostly like your farmers and not quite plantation owners, but your more rural farm types. All right. They wanted the states. They wanted the states to have more power as opposed to the federal government. They didn't trust a big federal government. They were afraid that it would be kind of like it would lead to a monarchy, right? And that's the whole reason we fought the revolution. So they didn't want that. The Federalist Papers were written by three men. We'll get into that on the next slide. But the Federalist Papers were basically essays that were written as articles published in newspapers by people who wanted the general populace to support the new Constitution. Now that was word salad, so let me kind of rephrase that. These were articles written by folks who were at the Constitutional Convention and wanted the states to ratify the new Constitution, people who supported the new Constitution. It was about 85 essays, and here were the authors. John Jay, who is this fellow right over here in this fancy robe-looking attire, he wrote 5 of the Articles of Confederation. James Madison, who's widely considered to be the father of the Constitution, he wrote a bulk of the Constitution and later went on to become the 4th president of the United States. He wrote about 29, I think, and then I can't remember, 25, something like that. He wrote some in the 20s, and then Alexander Hamilton wrote the other 59. So Hamilton really did the bulk of this, and that's because Hamilton was a huge nerd, very intelligent. If you've not watched the Hamilton musical on Disney, it's fantastic. It's very catchy. It's very good. Anyways, the Anti-Federalists, they kind of knew eventually, not from the get-go, but they kind of knew eventually that this new Constitution was going to pass. So they wanted something added to the Constitution that would kind of assuage their fears, right? It would kind of make them feel a little bit better. And that was a Bill of Rights. And so the first 10 amendments to the Constitution are known as the Bill of Rights. And they lay out individual rights that the Constitution explicitly protects. All right, we'll talk more about the Bill of Rights later on in Unit 4. But, you're probably familiar with some of them, right? The First Amendment, freedom of speech, freedom of expression, freedom of religion, freedom of the press, freedom of assembly, right to petition, right? The Second Amendment, right to bear arms, so on and so forth, right? But the Anti-Federalists wanted these added to the Constitution because, remember, they were afraid that a big government would not protect the people's rights. But if they included this, they could support it. All right. Anti-Federalists wanted to make sure that a Republican form of government was going to be enacted. Notice this is Republican with a small r. So this is not like Republican as in the Republican Party of today. This is like in the very literal sense of the word, a republic, a representative democracy, right? Something that would be working for the people. All right. Constitution was finally eventually ratified a year later in 1788. This map right here goes over how long it took each state to ratify. North Carolina was one of the last states to actually ratify the Constitution because we were largely a very anti-federalist state. All right. So let's jump into the preamble to the Constitution. All right. The preamble introduces the Constitution and states its goals. So if you were writing an essay and the Constitution was your essay, the preamble would be like your introductory paragraph in your thesis statement, right? So we, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourself and our posterity, do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America. I learned that in the 10th grade, and I have never forgot it since, and you're about to not ever forget it as well, because you're going to watch the same video that I watched when I was in 10th grade, and it made me never forget. It's so, you know what? We're going to play it anyway. Normally I skip over these videos and tell y'all to play them, but I'm going to play it anyway just because it's so good.
We the people, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, ourselves and our posterity do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America.
Tell me that's not catchy. If you tell me that's not catchy, you're lying. That's catchy. All right. So the goals of the Constitution, here they all are. The web quest on iCivics that I assigned you, the rules for running a country, they go into these more explicitly. There are 7 articles to the Constitution. All right. A lot of people just kind of mistakenly think that the amendments to the Constitution is the entirety of the Constitution. No, the Constitution is pretty long and drawn out. It's got 7 articles to it. Here's what they all lay out. The first one lays out the roles and powers of the legislative branch. That's Congress, the House of Representatives, and the Senate. We'll talk about them more next unit, as well as the executive and judicial branches, which we'll also talk more about next unit. Those are those 3 branches of government separated out. Throw back here that Montesquieu, was a big influencer of. All right. The fourth article here talks about relations among the states. What can the states do amongst each other? The 5th article talks about the amendment process, because when they wrote the Constitution, the founding fathers knew that the document would need to be amended over time, right? Amended to means to go back and eventually change or fix. All right. The 6th article is the Supremacy Clause, the supremacy of the national government, which basically just states that in matters between the federal and state governments, the national government, the federal government will always be supreme. And then Article 7 talks about the ratification process, which I talked about at the start of this, which basically laid out how the states would ratify the Constitution and officially put it into existence. All right. So I kind of mentioned this on the last one. Article 6 is the Supremacy Clause, right? The Constitution is the supreme law of the land. All right. States cannot override a federal law because the federal government will always be stronger than state governments. All right. Constitutional Convention. So it was called to order in 1787 in Philadelphia, the same place where the Declaration was written, the same place where the First and Second Continental Congresses met before and during the American Revolution. George Washington was called to preside over the Constitutional Convention because this is after the American Revolution, and George Washington is a national hero. All right. It was conducted in secret. All right. So a lot of people don't tend to recognize this. It's actually pretty crazy. Like, these people were overthrowing the American government. The Articles of Confederation was the law of the land. That was the governing document that we had. And at the Constitutional Convention, they threw it out and wrote a completely new government, right? But it's important to note, and this is actually really, really important that you know, whenever the Constitutional Convention met, they did not meet knowing that they were going to throw out the Articles of Confederation. They were there to revise the Articles of Confederation. They thought that they would just go and make a few tweaks and changes. Instead, they threw it out, wrote a completely new constitution. Anyways, like I was saying before my dog so loudly and rudely interrupted me, the original purpose was to revise the Articles. Important for you to know, the original plan was not to go and completely rewrite a new constitution. All right. Okay, so compromise. Compromise is a very key term here because we're going to be talking about a number of compromises that were struck at this Constitutional Convention. A compromise is a way of resolving disagreements by both sides kind of giving a little and getting a little. All right. So there's a couple things to note here. There was this thing called the Virginia Plan. It was proposed by James Madison. James Madison was a delegate to the Constitutional Convention from the state of Virginia. Virginia was the biggest, most populous state in the Union at the time. All right. James Madison and the Virginia Plan are going to call for a bicameral legislature. All right. Bicameral, bi meaning two, so a two-house legislature. He wanted representation in both of these houses to be based on state population. Virginia, remember, the most populated state at the time. So this would mean that Virginia would have more representation in Congress. Exactly as you would expect, smaller states are going to say, whoa, hold up, that's not fair. Just because you're bigger and have more people living in there in your state does not mean that you should get fairer treatment, all right? So people from smaller states, such as New Jersey, are going to say, no, 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 no. And this is what the New Jersey plan is going to call for. They called for a unicameral or a one-house legislature, all right? Representation would be equal for all states, and it obviously was opposed by the larger states because it would say, no, each state should get one vote in Congress or two votes or whatever. It says that it should be equal, all right? So a compromise was struck. A compromise was agreed to, all right? This compromise is called the Great Compromise or the Connecticut Compromise because the guy who came up with it was Roger Sherman from Connecticut. And so he says, we're going to take a little from Virginia plan. We're going to take a little bit from the New Jersey plan. So we're going to have a bicameral legislature, so two houses. So that's what the Virginia plan wanted. However, one house is going to be based on equal representation. The other house is going to be based on population, state population, all right? So the Senate is going to be based on equal representation. So there would be 2 senators per state, which is what the New Jersey plan folks wanted. And then the House would be based on state population, which is what the Virginia plan folks wanted. All right? Important for you to know that the Great Compromise was about congressional representation. Important for you to know, Congress is a 2-house system. We've got the House of Representatives and the Senate. We'll talk more about them later on, though. All right, another compromise that was struck too that's, one of the more embarrassing and degrading parts of American history is the 3/5 Compromise. All right, so there were a lot of slaves living in the United States at this time. There was a question about how to count enslaved people towards population. Well, free states said that slaves should not count for purpose of representation, but they should count for taxation. So the South should not get more representatives just because they have more slaves living in them, but they should be taxed for that purpose. Slave states obviously said no, they should count for representation purposes, but not for taxation, which is incredibly hypocritical because these slave states did not think of slaves as human beings, but as property, but they said that they should count as people so they can get more representation. Incredibly hypocritical and dumb on their behalf, but it is what it is. So the compromise that was agreed to was the 3/5 Compromise, which said that for every 5 slaves, 3 would count for purposes of representation and taxation. So basically, one slave is not a whole person. One slave is 3/5 of a person, which is just awful. But anyways, it's important that we know these things because, America is a great country, but we are not without our faults, and it's important that we know this, right? It's good that we know this. All right? Another issue that popped up was, well, how are we going to elect the president? How are we going to elect the leader of the executive branch? One side of people said that it should be strictly by the people. The people should decide. Another side said that Congress should decide. And so the compromise that was struck here was that, well, we'll do a little bit of column A, a little bit of column B. The Electoral College was created for this purpose. So the popular vote winner will choose delegates from each state to select the president and the vice president. We'll go more into the Electoral College later. It can be very confusing. As you probably well know, a person can win the popular vote but lose the presidency. A person can lose the popular vote and win the presidency, and that's what happened last time. Donald Trump lost the popular vote by 3 million votes, but he won the Electoral College and thus won the presidency. All right. So this is just a pretty neat resource. This is called 270 to Win. So if you're really interested in electoral presidential politics, this is pretty neat. You can kind of play around with it. In fact, I will open this up in a new tab here. Just kind of show you what I mean. All right, so this is an interactive map. So you can go down here and play with it a little bit. It's pretty neat. So this is right now, this is a 2020 consensus map. So this is like if the election were held today, it's likely that you can use this up here as the key. Dark blue states mean that it's safe Democratic states. So the likelihood that Joe Biden would win Illinois is all but assured. The likelihood that Joe Biden is going to win the state of California is all but assured. On the flip side, if it's dark red, like Tennessee, Kentucky, West Virginia, Mississippi, Alabama, Louisiana, so on and so forth, that means that President Trump is almost assuredly going to win those states. And then the lighter the shades means, the less assured that the less assured that that party will win that state. All right, so you can see these very light blue states of New Hampshire, Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, Minnesota. That means that these are lean Democratic states. So Joe Biden is somewhat likely to win these states, but it's not assured. Trump could win those states, right? Same with the red, right? Texas is a lean Republican state. In fact, I'd go so far as to say it's a likely Republican state, but that's just my personal opinion. And then these neutral colored states are toss-up states or swing states. So these states could go either way. And if you're wondering, well, what the heck's up with Nebraska and Maine here? They split their electoral votes, but that's a different story for a different day. But anyways, it's really cool. You can play with it. You can go and look at past presidential elections. So this is the electoral map for 2016. You can go all the way back. You can go back a long ways. You can go here and look at historical elections, which is pretty cool. You can go back to the very beginning of time, right? So if I wanted to say, what was it like in 2008? I can go back here and look at the 2008 election and see this is what the electoral map looked like then. But anyways, it's pretty cool. So that's it for this PowerPoint. Make sure you go on and complete the quiz on the next slide. And let me know if you got any questions. Have a good day, guys.